History is full of moments where survival was possible. The warning was clear. The solution was right there. But it came from someone who didn't look like us. And because of that, cities burned. Armies collapsed. Empires drowned. If you think intelligence guarantees survival, you're wrong. Sometimes survival requires something much harder: humility. If you want uncomfortable truths history tried to hide, subscribe now because this episode is going to hurt. Warning: 10 Norse settlers ignored Inuit survival wisdom. When Norse settlers arrived in Greenland around the 10th century, they brought European farming methods, Christian churches, and livestock. They saw themselves as civilized and the Inuit as primitive. But the Arctic does not care about pride. The Inuit had mastered seal hunting, fur clothing, igloos, seasonal migration. They understood ice patterns, wind shifts, survival rhythms. The Norse refused to adopt these methods. They clung to cattle farming in frozen soil. They built stone churches while their livestock starved. When the Little Ice Age intensified, Inuit communities survived. The Norse colonies vanished. They were offered survival, but it came from outsiders. Present parallel. Today, indigenous communities warn about climate patterns. Arctic tribes predict ice thinning years before satellites confirm it. Yet policymakers often dismiss traditional knowledge. Future question: when climate systems destabilize further, will we finally listen? Or will we disappear like the Greenland Norse, fossilized in pride? Warning: 09 European explorers ignored native knowledge. From the Americas to Africa, European expeditions repeatedly ignored indigenous survival expertise. Lewis and Clark survived partly because they listened to Sacagawea. But many others didn't. Spanish expeditions perished in deserts where tribes had mapped water routes for centuries. French explorers froze where natives had fur technology perfected over generations. Colonial arrogance cost thousands of lives. Survival was available. It simply required admitting others knew better. Present parallel. Modern humanitarian missions sometimes fail because planners ignore local community structures. Outside experts enter crisis zones assuming superiority and repeat old mistakes. Future question: will global cooperation become humility-based, or will technological power keep blinding us? Warning: 08 British officials ignored Indian famine advisors. During late 19th century famines in British India, local administrators and Indian advisors warned colonial authorities. Grain export policies were worsening starvation. They were ignored because economic ideology mattered more than local insight. Millions died in the Great Famine of 1876–78. The land knew. The farmers knew. But London did not listen. Present parallel. Economic decisions made far from affected communities still shape crises today. Food insecurity warnings often come from local NGOs first, long before governments act. Future question: how many modern famines will be preventable if we stop dismissing those closest to the suffering? Warning: 07 France ignored Algerian warnings. During the Algerian War, French officials underestimated nationalist momentum and rural resistance networks. Local voices warned that repression was fueling insurgency. Paris dismissed them. The result? A brutal war that ended French colonial rule in Algeria. They thought control meant strength. They ignored that control without understanding breeds rebellion. Present parallel. Governments today often misread local cultural identity movements. Suppression sometimes accelerates collapse. Future question. When centralized power faces decentralized resistance, who survives? Warning: 06 The U.S. ignored Vietnamese realities. American policymakers believed technological superiority would overwhelm guerrilla forces in Vietnam. Local analysts, journalists, even some insiders warned, this was not a conventional war. Terrain, culture, rural networks, they mattered more than airpower. Warnings were sidelined. The war dragged on, costing over 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese casualties. Survival required listening to those who understood the land. Present parallel. Modern conflicts still show a gap between intelligence reports and political narratives. Future question. Will future wars be won by firepower or by cultural literacy? Warning: 05 The Soviet Union ignored Afghan terrain reality. In 1979, the Soviet Union entered Afghanistan expecting swift stabilization. Afghan fighters knew the mountains. They understood guerrilla warfare. They understood endurance. Some Soviet advisors cautioned against deep occupation. Leadership pressed forward. A decade later, the war drained resources and morale, contributing to the USSR's collapse. The mountains spoke. Moscow did not listen. Present parallel. Military interventions still underestimate local terrain, ideology, and time endurance. Future question. Is geopolitical power illusion when geography refuses obedience? Warning: 04 Corporate giants ignored startups. Blockbuster ignored Netflix. Kodak ignored digital cameras. Innovation often begins outside the elite circle. Corporate boards dismissed young disruptors until they were destroyed by them. Survival in business required listening to outsiders, not protecting ego. Present parallel. AI startups now challenge trillion-dollar industries. Future question. Which giants today are laughing at the very voices that will replace them? Warning: 03 Governments ignored NGO reports. In multiple humanitarian crises, NGOs warned of genocides and humanitarian collapse before governments responded. In Rwanda, early warnings were documented. Political hesitation delayed intervention. 800,000 people died. The information existed. It just came from voices considered peripheral. Present parallel. Grassroots reports often detect instability earlier than official channels. Future question. How many tragedies unfold because bureaucracy filters truth? Warning: 02 Urban planners ignored local communities. From housing projects in the U.S. to redevelopment plans worldwide, planners often ignored residents. The result: social fragmentation, crime spikes, community collapse. Locals warned about design flaws, transit needs, safety risks. Experts overruled them. Survival of cities depends on listening downward, not just upward. Present parallel. Smart cities risk repeating top-down arrogance if local voices are sidelined. Future question. Will future megacities be engineered or co-created? Warning 01. The Global South's climate warnings. For decades, island nations and developing countries warned about rising sea levels and climate vulnerability. They were told to wait. Now floods, heat waves, droughts intensify globally. The people most affected spoke first. They were dismissed because they lacked geopolitical dominance. Survival of the planet now depends on listening to those who face collapse earliest. Final psychological question. What if the next existential warning comes from someone we don't respect? Will we recognize wisdom, or will identity blind us again? History doesn't just punish ignorance. It punishes arrogance. If this episode shifted your perspective even slightly, subscribe now. Because the next warning we ignore might not leave time for another episode.